It was supposed to be just another dinner. As I watched the waiter cross the room with the letter in hand, each step seemed to carry the weight of an earthquake. There, at the corner table, they were. Easy smiles, hands discreetly intertwined under the table, as if the world around them didn't exist. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, hours rehearsing every detail. After all, how do you expose a betrayal without losing control? It wasn't just the shame, it wasn't just the pain. It was the emptiness of someone who had believed a lie for so long. I knew everything. And they were about to find out. The letter was delivered, and I watched from afar. I had no intention of approaching. Not at that moment. I wanted to see the reactions. The silence at the table was cut by the tearing of the envelope. He confidently pulled out the paper first. His eyes, once so full of certainty, went wide. The look of disbelief on his face made me feel a twinge of satisfaction, one I didn't want to feel, but I couldn't help it. She, next to him, leaned over to read. I saw her fingers tremble. The colors drained from her skin, as if the truth had been punched in the stomach. This can only be a mistake, she whispered, her voice raspy, looking around frantically. But it wasn't. What was written in that letter was the naked revelation of everything she had been trying to hide. Their gazes met, searching for answers in each other, but the silence screamed louder. The words they read in the letter were like a knife, cutting through the atmosphere of lust and frivolity they had built up in secret. If you thought you could hide, I'm sorry to inform you, everything has been uncovered. Every lie, every encounter, every stolen touch. Now, deal with the consequences. Meanwhile, I stared at them from afar, my heart beating faster than I'd like to admit. It wasn't just anger. It was the weariness of months, maybe years, of doubts that I had finally confirmed. I felt the humiliation mix with a strange kind of control. They couldn't escape anymore. Not from that truth, which was finally no longer mine alone. It was a betrayal that began with small changes. An absent look, lame excuses about work meetings and then messages that were quickly deleted, smiles that no longer belonged to me. How could I have been so blind? No, I wasn't blind. I just didn't want to see. There's a kind of comfort in believing that everything is fine, even when the evidence starts to pile up like garbage at the bottom of a drawer. But that illusion doesn't last forever. And when the last piece of the puzzle fell into my hands, a photo of them together, I knew that the time for silence was over. You knew this would end badly, he hissed at her, throwing the card on the table. Why didn't you control yourself? Why did you leave clues? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the paper, as if trying to find a loophole. I thought I could manage, she finally said, her voice laden with regret that I knew to be false. They weren't sorry for what they'd done, but for getting caught. That was the most painful truth of all. The waiter returned to my table, trying to ignore the chaos that was beginning to unfold on the other side of the restaurant. Is everything all right, sir? He asked, with the polite tone of someone who would rather be anywhere else. I smiled, but it was an empty smile. Perfectly. They're finally getting what they deserve. The scene began to attract the attention of other customers. The restaurant, once a sophisticated setting, now seemed the scene of a drama as deep as the secrets that had been hidden there. She stood up, knocking over her chair with a clattering sound, and began to look around desperately. For a moment, I thought our eyes would meet, but she looked away. It wasn't shame. It was desperation. This can't be happening. He's here. He's here, I know it, she said, almost panicked. And what are we going to do? He retorted, trying to keep his composure but failing miserably. He also knew that there was no easy way out. I still had the messages, the photos, the details of every meeting they thought was secret. But none of that mattered now. All I wanted was to see them face the consequences, the same ones I had faced alone for so long, trying to deal with the suspicion and the feeling of inadequacy. While I dedicated myself to building a life, they destroyed it in silence. And then came the moment I knew would come. She, her eyes swollen with tears, finally looked in my direction. Her lips trembled, forming my name in a whisper that I couldn't hear, but felt. She knew. They knew. And there, in that restaurant, with dozens of strangers watching the scene unfold, the question hung in the air like smoke: what would happen next? She began to take hesitant steps towards me, while he lagged behind, mumbling something that sounded like a mixture of excuses and justifications. The look on her face was a mixture of pleading and dread. Perhaps she was ready to confess. Perhaps she wanted to convince me that there was an explanation for the inexplicable. But the truth? I didn't want to hear it. All I wanted was for them to feel, even for a moment, what I felt when I discovered that my trust had been destroyed. And now, with the evening still far from over, only one thing was certain: that dinner wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Welcome to the channel where betrayal is never tolerated. Here, we explore fictional stories that reveal how disloyalty can destroy lives, homes and dreams. Our aim is clear: to show that choices have consequences and that the truth always prevails. Get ready for an intense and emotional narrative. You're about to hear a shocking story that will hold you until the very last moment. Good story. The atmosphere exuded tranquility. A sophisticated restaurant in the heart of the city, with yellowish lights hanging from crystal chandeliers, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The aroma of fresh herbs mingled with the scent of exotic spices, a subtle invitation to relax and savor the moment. It was here that David and Clara often met for regular dinners, a habit they had cultivated over 10 years of marriage. For them, these moments were a kind of ritual, a break from the increasingly exhausting routine that life imposed. David was a man of simple but always striking gestures. Working as an architect, he devoted hours to projects that he believed would change the way people lived. His passion for what he did was evident, but it often meant spending days away from Clara, in endless meetings and trips to supervise construction work. Despite this, he made a point of being present in the small moments, whether it was bringing coffee to bed or leaving a note on the coffee table with a simple "I love you." Clara, on the other hand, was a woman of striking presence. A cultural journalist, she had a fascination for stories that explored the human soul. At home, she was vibrant and full of life, always with something new to tell about an exhibition she had visited or an interview with some eccentric artist. Despite her apparent vitality, there was a restless, almost imperceptible look in her eyes that hinted at something deeper, a sense of emptiness that emerged on nights when the house seemed too big and the silence was deafening. David and Clara's marriage had begun like a modern fairy tale. They met at a lecture on sustainable architecture. Clara was covering the event for the newspaper, while David was one of the speakers. He clearly remembered the blue dress she wore, the smile that lit up the room. She, on the other hand, never forgot his tone of voice, calm but full of conviction. It was the kind of encounter that seemed destined to happen. In the early years, the connection between them was palpable. Spontaneous trips, long nights talking about dreams and plans, declarations of love made between laughter and whispered promises. But, as with many marriages, routine began to set in. Over time, responsibilities piled up, bills to pay, deadlines at work, life projects that always seemed to be put off until, when the time was right. They still loved each other, or at least that's what they both believed, but there was something subtle, an almost invisible crack, that was beginning to form. In the restaurant that evening, David tried to hide his tiredness. The week had been exhausting, with tight deadlines and a team that seemed incapable of working without his constant supervision. Even so, he looked at Clara as if he wanted to absorb every detail of her. The way she gestured when she spoke, the way she held her wine glass with delicacy, as if it were the most important moment of the day. "You look so beautiful today, Clara," he said, interrupting a comment she was making about the last play she had seen. She smiled, but there was something distant in her eyes. "Thank you, David. And you look tired. Have you had enough sleep?" Sleep is a luxury these days, he replied with a laugh, trying to lighten the load of the conversation. But I'm here, and that's what matters, isn't it? She nodded, but the answer was accompanied by a brief silence. David noticed, but decided not to press her. They had experienced silences like this before, moments when Clara seemed to be lost in thoughts that he couldn't reach. He always assumed it was just the weight of modern life. After all, who doesn't feel like that sometimes? The truth, however, was more complex. Clara had been questioning many things. It wasn't just their marriage, but the very meaning of everything they did. The dinners at the restaurant were nice, but in her mind, they were beginning to seem more like a tradition than an act of genuine love. Even so, she didn't want to hurt him. David was a good man, she was sure of that. The problem, perhaps, was herself. While Clara struggled with her own thoughts, David continued to watch her, trying to decipher what was going on behind that smile. He had always prided himself on being intuitive, but lately he felt that something was slipping through his fingers. He wondered if he was doing enough, if work was taking too much away from him, if he should stop devoting himself so much to his career and focus more on his marriage. "I thought I'd take a few days off next month," said David, breaking the silence. "We can go away, just the two of us. How about that?" "That would be nice," replied Clara, but without the excitement he had expected. Behind her words, Clara knew that a trip wouldn't solve what she was feeling. But how could she explain this without sounding ungrateful? How to tell someone she loved, or thought she still loved, that perhaps something was missing? Back at their house, a place that seemed to have been carefully molded to represent the ideal home, Clara entered the bedroom with a sigh. The minimalist design of the space reflected David's taste, something she had always admired. He headed for the makeshift office downstairs, claiming he needed to finish revising some projects. This had become commonplace, each in a corner of the house, sharing the space, but not the same emotions. Clara sat on the bed, staring into the void. It was in these moments of loneliness that doubt and guilt surfaced most strongly. There was something inside her that yearned for more, something she couldn't name, but knew was missing. David, meanwhile, was typing away at his computer in his office, but his mind was far away. He was reviewing what she had said in the restaurant, her gestures, her tone. He sensed that something was different, but he couldn't pinpoint what. He wanted to believe that everything was fine, that it was just a reflection of the stress they were both under. But doubt was a shadow that was becoming difficult to ignore. And so, in that shared silence, the couple were further apart than they had ever been, even though they were so close physically. The tension that grew between them was subtle, almost imperceptible, but increasingly impossible to deny. Something was about to change, and neither of them could foresee the impact it would have on their lives. The days following the dinner in the restaurant followed the usual pattern, but with a subtext that only Clara seemed to notice. David continued to be involved with his projects, balancing tight deadlines and short trips to important meetings. The house maintained its rhythm, almost like an automatic mechanism. Clara, however, felt every second pass like a heavy drop echoing in her mind. It wasn't the work or the wedding itself. It was something that had been growing inside her, something that now seemed impossible to ignore. That weekend, David announced that he had to go to a nearby city for a conference. He seemed excited about the opportunity to present one of his latest projects, and Clara was keen to encourage him. Even if, deep down, his enthusiasm only amplified the sense of disconnection she felt. "Are you coming with me?" he asked, almost hopefully, as he folded some shirts to put in his suitcase. Clara smiled, a smile she knew he recognized as restrained. "I think I'd better stay. I need to finish an article, and it'll be good to have some time to concentrate." David didn't insist, but something in his eyes betrayed a slight disappointment. He wanted to believe that it was a genuine answer, but he couldn't deny the growing doubt that was creeping in. He wondered if he was failing at something, if Clara was slowly drifting away. But instead of addressing it directly, he decided it was best not to pressure her. Perhaps it was just a phase. The morning he left, Clara stood in the doorway, watching him get into his car and wave before disappearing down the street. As soon as he was gone, a different weight enveloped her. It wasn't guilt exactly, but a mixture of freedom and anxiety that she couldn't quite decipher. There was something more to this feeling, something she had been repressing for weeks. That evening, Clara left the house in a dress she rarely wore. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough to attract attention. She drove leisurely, listening to the sound of the engine and trying to calm her mind. There was something deliberate in that action, but also a touch of hesitation. When she parked in front of the bar, she hesitated for a moment before turning off the car. He took a deep breath and went in. The bar was discreet, but had a welcoming charm. Warm lights illuminated the room and the music in the background created an inviting atmosphere. Clara knew she wasn't there by chance. Shortly after she sat down, he appeared, a confident-looking man with a smile who seemed to know more than he was saying. They had exchanged glances before, in casual encounters promoted by mutual friends. This time, however, there was no group to soften the moment, just the two of them. "You came," he said, with a tone that oscillated between surprise and certainty. "I came," Clara replied, with a calculated calmness, even though her heart was racing. The conversation started off light, almost banal, but soon delved into more personal territory. He was charismatic, the kind of person who seemed to understand exactly what to say to fill the gaps that Clara didn't know how to explain. Throughout the evening, between sips of wine and restrained laughter, the tension in the air became palpable. Clara knew what she was doing, she knew where things were heading. And yet she didn't stop. Hours later, they left the bar together. The fine rain that began to fall seemed to add to the intensity of the moment. Every step Clara took seemed charged with meaning, and at the same time empty of any sense of responsibility. They got into his car, and the silence that enveloped them was more powerful than any words they could have exchanged. When they reached their destination, a small apartment in the city center, Clara hesitated again. She didn't say anything, but he seemed to understand. He held her hand firmly, as if to say that she was safe there, that there was no need for explanations. She knew it wasn't true, but at that moment, she chose to believe it. The next few hours were a blur of sensations. Clara surrendered to the moment, a mixture of pleasure and confusion that left her torn between ecstasy and regret. On the one hand, she felt alive, something she hadn't experienced for a long time. On the other, she knew she was crossing a line that could never be undone. The next morning, when she woke up, reality struck. The apartment, which had seemed enveloping the night before, now had a strange, almost suffocating air. Clara got up in silence, dressing quickly while he was still asleep. It wasn't guilt she felt, but an urgent need to escape, not to face what it meant. She left before he could wake up, leaving behind the echo of what she had done. When she got home, David had already called, leaving a message on his cell phone. His voice sounded excited, telling her about the success of the performance and asking how her weekend was going. Clara listened to the message with a heavy heart, but didn't reply immediately. She didn't know what to say, or even if she should say anything. David returned the following evening, bringing flowers as he always did when he traveled. Clara thanked him, but the distance between them seemed greater than ever. He hugged her, and she remained motionless for a moment before returning his embrace. He noticed her hesitation, but decided to ignore it. Maybe it was just tiredness. Over the next few days, Clara tried to get back into her routine, but something inside her had changed. Every gesture from David, every act of affection, seemed to amplify what she felt, a disconnection that had now become unbearable. She began to avoid deeper conversations, distracting herself with work or social commitments. But David, always attentive, noticed the changes. One evening, while Clara was working on her computer, David came into the office looking serious. "We need to talk," he said, sitting down in the chair next to her. "I feel that something is different. Do you want to tell me what's going on?" Clara swallowed. The words seemed stuck in her throat. She wanted to confess, she wanted to explain, but she knew there wasn't enough justification. It's nothing, David. I'm just overwhelmed. He studied her for a moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and doubt. If you say so, I'll believe it. But I'm here, Clara. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. She nodded, forcing a smile. I know. Thank you. But that same night, while David slept, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The betrayal she had tried so hard to bury was there, growing like a shadow, about to reveal itself. She knew it was only a matter of time before it all came out, and she feared the consequences. And just like that, the thin line that held together the life they had built was about to break. The night was charged with tension, as if the air around them was about to explode. David had noticed something strange about the way Clara had been looking at him over the last few days. Her glances weren't ones of affection or concern, they were calculated, as if she was waiting for something. He knew he had to act. The doubt, the anguish that had been eating away at him, was no longer tenable. Determined, he chose an unexpected approach. That evening, he invited Clara to dinner at the same restaurant they always went to. The intention was simple, to confront her, but subtly. He knew he needed more than words, he needed proof. And now he had it. As they entered the restaurant, Clara looked uncomfortable. Her restless hands held her bag tightly and she avoided looking directly at David. He noticed, but didn't say anything. He just ordered her favorite wine, pouring the glasses calmly, as if everything was perfectly normal. Clara, are you all right? You seem tense, he asked, his voice calm, but with a weight that she felt immediately. I'm fine, she replied, forcing a smile. Just a bit tired, maybe. David nodded, bringing the cup to his lips. The silence between them was thick, almost palpable. Clara looked around, as if searching for something, or someone. I've been thinking, began David, breaking the silence. About us. About how things have been over the last few months. Clara swallowed, but kept her face neutral. And what have you concluded? That something has changed, he said, propping his elbows on the table and leaning slightly towards her. And that you're not being completely honest with me. Clara opened her mouth to reply, but he held up his hand, interrupting her. Before you say anything, I want to show you something. David placed an envelope on the table. Clara stared at him, confused, but without moving a muscle. Her expression said it all, fear, nervousness, a mixture of emotions that she was struggling to hide. Open it, he said, with disconcerting calm. Clara hesitated, but finally gave in. Her hands trembled as she tore open the envelope and pulled out the contents, photos, printed messages, records of meetings. Every detail of her betrayal of her lover was there, exposed. David, she began, but her voice failed her. She looked at him, trying to find some spark of empathy, but his eyes were like ice. I know everything, Clara. Every lie, every excuse. And now, I want to hear from you, why? She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I don't know. I don't know what to say. It wasn't planned, David. It was a mistake, something that got out of hand. A mistake, he repeated, his voice colder than ever. Something that got out of hand. Clara, it's not a mistake. It's a choice. Several choices, over and over again. She remained silent, the weight of his words crushing her. David leaned forward, his tone lower but charged with emotion. Do you know what hurts me the most? It's not the fact that you betrayed me. It's the fact that you allowed it to happen while I was doing everything for us, while I believed we were okay. David, please. I'm sorry. There's no justification, but I still love you. I don't want this to destroy everything we've built. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Love? Clara, you don't love someone and do that. Love isn't just a word, it's an action. And your actions have shown exactly the opposite. While she was trying to find something to say, the waiter approached with an envelope. David waved for him to hand it directly to Clara. She opened it hesitantly, and what she read made her expression change completely. "David, what's this?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. "Read it out loud," he demanded. Clara hesitated, but obeyed. "We know that you were using our client to hide financial transactions. This is now in the hands of the authorities." She turned pale. Clara's lover, apparently so secure, had involved her name in a fraudulent scheme. David discovered this while investigating the betrayal, and what was supposed to be an emotional scam turned into something much bigger. "You got involved with someone who not only destroyed our marriage, but also put your reputation at risk. Clara, do you have any idea what that means?" "That can't be right," she muttered, running her hands through her hair in utter despair. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "But you knew enough to betray me," said David, his voice cutting. "And now, Clara, I'm not the only one who wants answers. The consequences of that choice aren't just between you and me." Clara burst into tears, unable to process everything that was happening. David, on the other hand, felt a strange relief. He wasn't there to destroy Clara, but to finally put an end to something that had been broken for a long time. While the restaurant continued to function around them, as if nothing was happening, Clara realized that her life had changed forever. The secret, now revealed, wasn't just a betrayal, it was something that threatened everything she knew. And, as she looked at David, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Clara remained silent, the words in the letter still hanging over her mind like a heavy cloud that she couldn't dispel. David, for his part, watched her with a mixture of coldness and disappointment, his arms crossed and his expression inscrutable. He wouldn't say anything more. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said was on that table, exposed, with no room for excuses or interpretations. The restaurant, as sophisticated and welcoming as it was, now seemed suffocating. Clara looked at the soft lights and the movement of the other customers, but she couldn't absorb anything. It was as if the world around her had become a blur, while every mistake she had made came to the surface, pressing down on her like a giant wave about to engulf her. "David," she began, her voice breaking, "I didn't know about that. About him using my name. I swear." "You knew enough to trust him, Clara," David replied, without raising his voice, but with a firmness that cut her like a blade. "You knew enough to destroy what we had. Now that's just a consequence." His words carried an almost unbearable weight. Clara tried to reply, but felt a lump in her throat that stopped her. There was no justification. There were no words that could erase what she had done. Try as she might, she knew that this was the beginning of the end, perhaps not just of her marriage, but of the life she knew. The waiter approached again, this time hesitantly, with a bill discreetly placed on the table. David took it, put in a few notes without even looking at the amount and stood up, straightening his jacket. "Come on," he said, without looking back. Clara followed him mechanically. The night, cool and full of city noises, hit her like a blow from reality. David walked ahead, his stride firm and resolute. He stopped beside the car, opened the door for Clara and then got in. The silence on the way back was deafening. David drove without looking away from the road, his jaw clenched, while Clara stared at the window, her reflection in the glass looking like a stranger. When they arrived home, David parked carefully and got out of the car. Clara hesitated before following him. The house, which had once been a symbol of the love they had built together, now looked like a cold, lifeless structure. As they entered, Clara almost felt the weight of the tension increase. "We need to talk," said David, finally, as he left his keys on the kitchen worktop. "And I want you to be honest. Totally honest, Clara. No more half-truths." Clara felt the floor drop away. She knew she could no longer run away, but she also knew that the full truth had the potential to destroy them completely. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know how it started," he replied, his voice more controlled than she had expected. "And I want to understand why you thought he was worth so much that you risked everything." She sat down on the sofa, her head down, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her dress. I don't even know how to explain it," she began, hesitantly. "It was a slip. A moment when I felt lost." "Lost," David repeated, sarcastically. "Clara, we all feel lost sometimes. But you made a choice. Several choices." Clara closed her eyes, trying to keep her composure. "I know. And there's no excuse. I'm not trying to justify anything, David. I'm just trying to explain." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Then explain. Make me understand." She took a deep breath. "It was one of those nights when you were away on business. I felt alone. There was something in me that, I don't know. I started to question everything. Us, the life we had. And then he came along. It wasn't planned. It was easy. He knew what to say. He made me feel alive." David laughed, but not in a friendly way. "Alive? Clara, do you think being alive is deceiving someone who trusted you? Who loved you?" His words hit her hard, and she let out a tear. "I was wrong. I know that. But at the moment, it felt different. As if I'd found something I'd lost years ago." David shook his head. "What you lost wasn't outside of us, Clara. It was inside you. And instead of dealing with it, you destroyed everything." Silence fell again as Clara tried to catch her breath. "What about us now?" she finally asked, her voice almost inaudible. David stared at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before: exhaustion. Not physical, but emotional. He seemed to be carrying a weight that he alone could not bear. "I don't know," he replied sincerely, "I don't know if there's an us after this." Clara felt the impact of the words like a punch in the gut. She knew that the chances of rebuilding what they had lost were slim, but hearing it from David himself made the reality even crueler. David turned, walking towards the stairs. He stopped halfway and looked back, his expression now softer, but still full of pain. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room. I don't want to talk about it anymore today." Clara nodded, but couldn't say anything. She sat on the sofa, the silence of the house enveloping her completely. It was as if the world had stopped, leaving only loneliness and the weight of her choices to keep her company. That night, while David tried to sleep, his mind was spinning non-stop. He relived every moment they had spent together, every gesture, every smile, trying to find where everything began to crumble. He wanted to hate her, he wanted to use his anger as a shield, but all he felt was an immense emptiness. Clara, on the other hand, remained in the room, staring at the ceiling. Her mind couldn't find rest either. She knew that what she had done could not be undone, but the question that tormented her most was there anything left to save? Or had she lost everything? They both knew that the next day would bring more questions than answers. And that the road ahead would be long and full of uncertainties. The morning arrived with an even heavier silence than the night before. Clara woke up on the living room sofa, her body sore and her mind even more tired. The light coming through the gaps in the curtain seemed to mock her, bringing the clarity she feared to face. David was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a forgotten cup of coffee beside him. His gaze was fixed on the window, lost in thoughts that Clara knew he wouldn't be able to reach. She approached, hesitantly, but he didn't look at her. "David," she began, her voice shaky. "Can we talk?" He took a few seconds to reply, still staring at the window. "I've been thinking a lot during the night," he said at last. "About us. About what happened. And about what comes after." Clara sat down in front of him, her hands clenching the fabric of her pajamas. She wanted to say something, anything, but she knew that, at that moment, what mattered most was listening. David took a deep breath before continuing. I can't look at you the same way anymore, Clara. Not after everything. But that doesn't mean I want to destroy you. She blinked, surprised. It wasn't what she'd expected to hear. What do you mean? I'm not going to expose you. What happened has caused enough pain. I won't take it any further with the authorities, but you'll have to deal with the consequences on your own. And as for us, he paused, his eyes finally meeting hers. There is no us anymore. Not after what you've done. The words, though predictable, hit Clara hard. She felt tears welling up, but didn't try to wipe them away. I understand, she whispered. And I'm sorry for everything. For destroying what we had. David shook his head slowly. It's not just what we had, Clara. It's who I thought you were. And who I thought we were. The silence settled again, but this time it wasn't just one of sadness, it was one of acceptance. They knew they had reached a point of no return. Over the next few weeks, Clara tried to put the pieces of her life back together. Her lover, whom she had discovered to be a manipulative and dangerous man, disappeared completely after accusations of fraud began to surface. She was questioned by the authorities, but managed to prove that she had no direct involvement in the schemes. Even so, the impact on her reputation was devastating. The newspaper where she worked decided to dismiss her, claiming that the situation was incompatible with the company's image. Without a job and with an empty house, since David had moved into a small apartment while the divorce proceedings were finalized, Clara was forced to face the loneliness she feared so much. She began attending therapy sessions, trying to understand why she had destroyed something that, in retrospect, meant so much to her. It was a long and painful road, but for the first time in months, she felt she was facing her demons rather than running away from them. David, on the other hand, found a kind of peace in solitude. The new apartment was small but cozy. He immersed himself in work, using the pain as fuel to create even more impressive projects. But it wasn't just work that kept him busy. During a meeting in a cafe, he met Helena, a graphic designer hired to collaborate on one of his projects. Helena was calm, self-assured, with a smile that seemed to light up the room. At first, David was reluctant to get involved. He still bore the scars of what had happened to Clara. But little by little, Helena showed him that love could be something light, without secrets or betrayals. They started going out casually, and David discovered that he could, indeed, find happiness again. It was a different, more mature love, built with care and patience. Months later, the divorce was finalized. Clara kept the house, but she knew it was just an empty space now, without David. She decided to sell the property and use the money to make a fresh start. She chose a smaller town, where no one knew her past. There, she got a job at a small local magazine and began to build a new life, away from the chaos she had created. David and Helena, on the other hand, decided to take their relationship a step further. He introduced Helena to his family and friends, something that made him feel like he was finally leaving the past behind. He knew that the scars of what happened to Clara would always be there, but he also knew that they didn't have to define him. The final impact of the story was clear: choices have consequences. Clara lost almost everything because of the decisions she made, but she found a chance to start again. David, despite his pain, found a new love and a new purpose. And, in the end, they both went their separate ways, each carrying the lessons of what they had experienced. And so ends this story, showing that betrayal not only destroys relationships, but also leaves deep scars on everyone involved. Now we want to know, what did you think of this story? What do you think about the choices the characters made? Leave your comment below, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any more stories like this. Remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Our aim is to show how these decisions can have devastating consequences, always reflecting on respect, loyalty, and the choices we make in life. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.